Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the downfall is mainly two things. First, that there's less importance locally placed on American universities, and it's less emphasized as a path for students. So students are, for instance, encouraged to pursue the skilled trades or pursue other opportunities. And second, that there's comparatively less prestige and importance placed on American institutions compared to similarly elite global institutions. So as a smart international student, for instance, you're more incentivized to either stay within your home country and not go to like the New York University or some comparative university you can get to. You're emphasized to take advantage of local opportunities because the explanation becomes like why American universities are losing resources or actively rejecting international students, why they don't want you, why like NUS or Oxford or some prestigious institution at your local country would be a better option. And I think the alternative is to maintain the power of American institutions, continue to like fund them, continue to have them be like the primary source of research and innovation in every given field, to like be the global thought leader in like economics or poli-sci or whatever. The three arguments, but mainly two I will bring up. First, about why we better develop developing countries. Secondly, being why American students are better off. And thirdly, being why we reduce the American influence of thought on academia. So on developing countries first. In the status quo, many international students are encouraged to get education in American institutions due to their perceived prestige. There's the perception that they can break into the US job market, which is the strongest in a variety of fields like technology. Second, the perception that they can get the best professors, teaching resources, and prestige that they can't get in their local economies. So the smartest students, or the students that just are able to like afford the ability to go abroad, are likely to have American universities be the first idea in their mind as to the best place to apply for their given field. We think this is bad because of the brain drain that this causes from developing countries, where a lot of the smartest students, those that have the money to take risks, to make businesses, to pursue academia, to that will be able to get a job within like the best bank in the country or whatever, those people are all going to American universities in the status quo. And we think the downfall then, when there's less prestige and importance placed on it, when the messaging is less that Harvard is the best place to get education, but NUS can also be a great place for you to develop your economic knowledge and get good jobs, then what happens is more students are then encouraged to stay closer to the developing countries they come from. So as a smart student in Thailand, you are encouraged to pursue the best local opportunity available to you, for instance, Bahamasaat University or NUS, which is also in your region. So we think even if we were forced to defend the worst case comparative, that yes, they still study abroad, but they still go to like Oxford and NUS and all these best institutions, we still think this is comparatively better than going to the US, because once you enter US institutions, you're encouraged to get jobs in the US. You're encouraged to develop the very big already US economy, right? And get Goldman Sachs jobs rather than that at your local Asia Pacific bank. So given that you stay within the local region, even if you're pursuing still like one that's in like a neighboring country that's more developed, the work that you're doing is more likely to develop your local economy. You're more likely to be working on Asia Pacific issues. You're more likely to have your economics research stay within the academic sphere of increasing Asia Pacific life well-being and Asia Pacific GDP. For instance, we think this is good because developing countries, by nature of their name, need more of this development to boost the quality of life of their citizens. If a student entrepreneur that would have otherwise started their tech startup in Silicon Valley is able to do so in Vietnam or South Africa because they're discouraged from going to these like dying US institutions that don't even want them, then we think that in and of itself is better for the vulnerable Vietnamese people that otherwise wouldn't have had jobs, whereas in the US comparatively, you have a lot more economic opportunity, less economic development is needed there. Next, let's talk about American students. American students right now are pressured to go to universities regardless of their academic interests and skills, right? So they're told that university is where the best opportunity to get prestigious jobs. It's the place where all the smart students belong and where all the other smart students they see in their class are going to. So regardless of what they're good at, regardless of what type of work-life balance they want, regardless of their current economic scenario, things like student loans and whether they can repay them, they go to university in the status quo. Note that because of the easy access to student loans that happened after World War II in the American system, this is why the cost of university in the States has been astronomically high in recent years and is only continuing to go up, right? So the current dominance of American universities, the fact that this is emphasized for so many local students, is what allows these universities to continue charging such astronomical tuition, knowing that there will be students that pay it anyway because they see it as the opportunity to a better life. We think with the rhetoric that is like currently continuing, it's actually good that we're emphasizing like universities are not the one place that you can get good opportunities, right? That there are skilled trades colleges that are comparatively better for students who are good at like hands-on things. That there are cheaper community colleges that aren't that provide you equal opportunity to get a grounding in things like computer science and to get a good job and things like that. So we think the downfall of American universities as the forefront of where students are encouraged to go, and the comparative elevating of better opportunities for post-secondary and career-based education is what's allowing American students to not be trapped into predatory cycles of things like student loans, not be encouraged to take on very expensive education without even considering if this is good for their goals, good for their skill set, and things like that. So we think the reason why the downfall is better on our side is when students are encouraged to think more critically about whether university education is the best for them, to question these higher level institutions, to question their like beliefs and what they're teaching you and what the types of skills they're actually instilling in you, and they see better opportunities elsewhere. They are more likely to pursue those other opportunities. They're more likely to not be trapped in student debt. They're more likely to start their life with a degree or some form of certification that's actually employable, and then as a result be able to actually set themselves up for a good economic future, buy a house, like have a family, etc. Sure. Closing or opening actually. Or closing, sorry. Someone go.
Yeah, so in the downfall, even in the short to medium term, universities in America still remain prestigious. But the difference is, because of US government federal funding cuts to universities, they are forced to do things like jack up tuitions for all of the American students who are going.
I think jacking up tuition is symmetric. And the reason is because even right now when the government is funding universities, they are able to jack up tuition because they know it's going to be paid, and they know that student loans are going to be like very numerous in order for students to pay them. I think when fewer students are choosing universities, they actually have an incentive to lower their prices, right? And the reason is because they now see that people aren't willing to pay this astronomical price anymore. It's a basic supply and demand equation where you lower prices to induce demand, right? So yeah. Last thing I'll flag, so closing doesn't take it, we think we reduce the American influence of thought because strong American universities have so much specific agendas and biases in their research, and many schools in the world follow the influence of strong American universities like the Ivies, like the U Chicago School of Economics that was the forefront for neoliberal developments in economics, and also American universities are overwhelmingly pressured by the government in the scope and focus of their research. So for instance, the American government overwhelmingly prioritizes military development or scientific innovation into military and violent related engineering in order to grow their military. We think this oversaturation is bad because academia plays an important role in what scientific developments are funded and what types of human elements are studied. Tessa will elaborate on this, and we think it is better if it is diversified to other countries. Back to Rose.
Thank you very much for your fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the LO.
I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I want to start by contending with opening government's characterization of what the downfall of universities actually looks like. And then I'm going to give you two arguments, one on the effects that happen to students, and the second on the restrictions of public goods that universities provide due to their downfall. So first of all, what does the downfall look like? So it is not simply a disregard for the humanities. There has been suspicion for the professions since the 80s. And, having people say oh, you shouldn't go into gender studies or English or whatever, this is nothing new, and it's not particularly important, especially because the humanities are only a specific sector of the university. It's also not degree inflation or anything. It is the massive action that has been taken against American universities, particularly in the past 5 years. So there's some lead up to this with the COVID and the suspicion that people have towards expertise. But again, the thing that actually culminates in this is the recent action by Trump, and this is what's most important, which is the subjection to the federal government that universities are experiencing. They're discrediting not just through some narratives, but through active crackdowns by the federal government. This is a downfall of the prestige that universities used to enjoy, and at the very least, were still unable to enact until recently, because university enrollment has still been crawling upwards for decades. University prestige is still meaningful, and people are still training really hard to get their kids into Ivy Leagues. It is only this most recent political action that actually changes it to an inflection point where universities are entering a point of downfall. So this is largely a future-looking motion. It is not about what has happened. It is not, rather than, it is about what will happen. Also, just the idea that like other foreign universities doing well is like the downfall of the American university system. I simply see no reason to believe this. Saying there is another institution that is similarly good to Harvard does not mean that Harvard is now bad or anything like that. So, two arguments. One, what are the effects on the student body? So, what's happening to the universities right now? So, they are, like, first of all, there are financial issues. They are having their funding cut. They are having, like, international student attendance withheld. And this means that it is more difficult for them to pull in money. And what this means is that they have to do things like raise tuition on students in order for them to be able to stay afloat. The second thing is that open speech is actively being attacked within the context of the university. Think of something like Trump attacking Colombia for supporting Palestine. And this is reducing the actual ability of people to express themselves within a university. Finally, the student experience of education is more actively being demeaned at the moment. So, like previously, there were narratives going around that universities aren't important or that they, aren't valuable. There is now a massive change in the fact that the political power, or like in the United States, or like from the federal government, is actively being directed against these universities. So how does this affect student life? First of all, it means that students who are either lower income or, even like middle class often have difficulty actually paying for these and have to go into more student debt. Notice that it's not just like the big universities being affected by this. It's a lot of like the smaller private universities that people still rely on, or public universities that are having their funding cut. What this means is that as a student, not only are particularly poor people less likely to be able to get into university or justify getting a degree, it also means that more students have to graduate with student loan debt, and this is just this makes their development in the long term worse. It makes their quality of life worse as graduates. Secondly, it affects the ability of the university to actually effectively educate people. Because notice, when students are both being not just being told that their education is not valuable, but actively having their attempts at expression or activism crippled, or when the university itself is afraid to provide a platform where people can meaningfully express their beliefs, this creates a situation where people cannot maximize their intellectual development anymore. It means that as a student, you are less likely to actually gain useful skills from a university degree. So for people in the humanities, it takes the ability to learn to write effectively and persuasively, and it reduces your ability to actually do that because you can't engage with what you actually believe and with what your professors actually believe. And more generally, it means that the function of education within society is reduced. So this means previously where you might have had a few educated people in a discussion, or a few people who have really put their life into trying to understand more intellectual matters in a given social group, you just have people who are less able to do that. And this means that decision making as a democracy is reduced in its quality. It means that the kinds of discourse that are being legitimated are less effective, this kind of thing. I'll take a POI.
The first claim is odd. Are schools like Harvard seriously compromising on their criterion to admit lower tier students at a higher sticker price? Or are they forced to lower their sticker price to admit students in the same caliber they historically have?
So it doesn't really matter what Harvard in particular has to do, because notice that when the federal government takes action against Columbia or Harvard or any of these major universities, and it doesn't go and it goes through, this means that any smaller university, which has a tiny fraction of the political influence, has to adopt the same policy. Harvard has a $30 billion endowment, and so sure, they can afford to cut the sticker price maybe. But for smaller state universities that a lot of people rely on to get good degrees and useful degrees, they have a massive decline in their ability to actually attend, and tuition has to be raised because they don't have that kind of endowment to rely on. Secondly, how does this affect society writ large? So, the essential issue is that this leads to less research output, because when universities, have sufficient funding, they put a lot of that funding into research. This is what builds their prestige. And this means you get things like research into healthcare that are just like general public goods, but it also means you get research into things that are generally not cared as much about like by the private sector. This means you do get like discussions about gender. It means you do get discussions about sexuality, and we think those are useful for society. We think that when universities have their funding cut and their reputation attacked, not only are they less able to produce quality output, but they are less able to actually convey that output to society because the prestige they need to do that is handicapped. For these reasons, proud to oppose.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want to note the most important thing first, what the actual comparative is within this debate. We do not need to defend the US government cracking down on free speech at places like Harvard, at places like other American universities. This is not the comparative. We do need to defend a less funding of these universities, less prestige of these universities, and less pressure of American students to go to universities rather than looking into other options. All of the impacts that opening opposition gives you on free speech are simply not within the realm of this debate, because this is not inherent to the downfall of American universities that the government starts pressuring them to like crack down on free speech. This is simply a side effect of the Trump administration being in power, and therefore is something that is going to happen on either side of the House that you should not consider as a delta in this debate. The downfall, therefore, means less funding, less prestige. What does this look like? This looks like students, when they are assessing their options for post-secondary, not focusing as heavily on universities. This looks like employers being less likely to require a university degree to get certain jobs and being more likely to take people with just a secondary school degree or a trade school degree or some applicable community college like diploma or something like that. This looks like people knowing that they have other options. It looks like parents being less focused on the prestige of universities, less likely to pressure their children to go into it, which means that children that don't think they will do well at university are less pressured to go into it on our side as well. This also means impacts on student loan debt. So opening opposition is talking about how student loan debt will increase because the amount that universities will have to charge will be higher. I think, first of all, on weighing, even if this is true in our worst case, people will only go to university on our side of the house if they know they can afford it, because it is less prestige. There is less societal, parental, and employer pressure to go into these universities, so people are more likely to make a more rational decision on the matter. People currently know in the status quo if they cannot afford universities, but they simply make this trade-off anyway because they literally believe that they cannot get a job if they don't go to universities. When they know that they have other opportunities, they are more likely to correctly assess that they don't have the money for this right now and not take on boatloads of student loan debt. I will also note, just on scope versus magnitude here, we are impacting the poor people who do not have the ability to pay back student loans. We are impacting people who might not have the ability to graduate, who on our side of the house are on their side of the house are taking out student loans, potentially not being able to pay them back, and even if they don't get their degree, are just like suffocating in student loan debt for eternity. We are impacting these most vulnerable individuals. On their side, even in their best case, they are only getting impact on people who are already rich enough to make the rational choice that they can afford to go to university. So even if it is marginally more expensive, I think they are impacting a less relevant group here. Okay. The other thing that I will note on the OO case is they talk about research output and how that will go down. I will note this is not necessarily true. Note the comparative Sherry gives you on other countries and how many other universities that are not American around the world are still able to do research and are still very, very likely, and in fact more likely on our side, to be doing this research. Adam says that other institutions rising is not the downfall of American universities, but Sherry tells you why it is, because this is comparative. Because because there is always an incentive to invest in things like medical research and things like academic research of governments around the world. And when there is no longer the same level of prestige placed on American universities, then governments and sources of funding are likely to flock to other universities with some level of prestige, are likely to fund their research instead. So this is comparative in that there is always that incentive to fund research that does not change in this debate. So when you take the prestige away from US universities, they will go to other universities instead. This also has the knock-on benefit of preventing academia from being so Western and especially US-centric. We think this is incredibly important, panel, because note that the downfall of US hegemony over information is an enormous impact that affects every aspect of life. When one country has such an influence in determining what kind of medical procedures are researched, what kind of cultures and histories are researched, they're literally controlling the narrative of how all of world history plays out. They're controlling the future of this. When they are not looking into a certain medical problem because it specifically affects a group of people that American researchers are biased against for some reason of intrinsic racism within the country or something, this is hugely damaging to this group of people who are potentially not getting the same level of medical research. When they are disregarding a specific culture's history and refusing to acknowledge it in these universities that are considered the most creditworthy in the world, when people are no longer seeing the value of this culture, this is hugely damaging to that culture, to people living within it who are now not able to access this kind of respect that they deserve for their history and their culture. We think this is principally unjustified, and just on the fact that we are supporting the downfall of American universities, which allows these other universities around the globe to rise and to represent what they think ought to be represented, is probably a good thing. Okay, so I'll take a POI from CEO.
Countries that are highly academically prosperous probably have a high likelihood to have hegemony over information in academia anyway. The counterfactual likely China.
No, okay, I don't think the counterfactual is China having this level of hegemony that the US has, already. There is significant, universities around the globe. It is not like it is just going to transition that fast to one other. There are a lot of universities, and people also have an incentive to go to their local university for things like convenience. But I also think, insofar you say that all countries are going to have hegemony, the reason why they have this is because of the significant level of prestige placed on American universities. China is never going to have the same level of prestige because of the geopolitical factors at play, where America is always going to be pushing back on this kind of idea of their hegemony. Okay, so now to rebuild and weigh our points. I think what Sherry has given you is already round winning in this debate. The developing nations are able to have less brain drain, which means that people seeking prestige in education are likely to seek it out more locally, either at local educational institutions where they are staying within their staying within their local economies, but also seeking things like prestige present by starting a business locally, when this prestige does not just have to be sought by going to Harvard or going to Stanford or wherever, but they are likely to seek this by pushing into their local economy and actually benefiting their communities. So proud to propose.
Every year, the American federal government and state governments give to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars per year to the American university system. They have been doing this for decades. The idea that the downfall of the American university is something that we should value is not something that comes amorphously. It's not something where the culture just suddenly shifted towards a desire for people to become plumbers. Instead, it is a targeted political movement by right-wing corporatists who see this slush of public money going to the hands of universities who wish for that to instead be privatized. Their method of getting us to want there to be a downfall of the American university system was simple. First, politicize universities. Make them no longer seem a bastion of education where people can learn from a diverse array of ideas, a diverse array of understandings, and come out more well-rounded and thoughtful. Instead, divide and conquer. Make it seem that people who go to university are liberals who are only ever going to serve the interests of the Democratic Party, so that way anybody who supports an education is doing so out of self-interest and not a desire to improve the country. Thus, when you want to take away money from universities, you're not hurting education, you're hurting your political opponent. Then it said that the second version of this was to say that the output of these universities was bad. It was to say that actually peer review is a scam. The process of research is a scam. They are only ever researching things that provide no value to society. That blue skies research is useless because that is money that could better be served into products today that make money for corporations. And the more and more that this was a narrative that was propagated, that all research is useless, it meant that people who wished to become researchers at universities were seen as less valuable, were seen as undesirable, and thus cutting their funding was seen as a value to the American public because it would perceivably improve the GDP. Adam tells you very clearly that this has come to a head now, where the Trump administration has, after years of this swell of antagonism towards the American university system, begun the final approach to actually sowing the distrust and the downfall of the American university by slashing their budgets, by taxing their endowments, by restricting the amount of people that they can bring in, so that money can then instantly be funneled directly into the private sector year over year over year. Our case from opening opposition is simple, that is, by obvious metrics, much worse globally and domestically. Why is it worse? First, I want to talk about research output. Why? The first thing is because the research output of universities is massive. It is painstakingly massive. It ranges from new information about biomedical technologies that can literally cure rare diseases to understandings of assisted suicide in prisons and in other areas of marginalized groups. The importance of this is that these are thoughts that in many instances would never get researched in the private sector. Why? First of all, because in many instances they are not profitable, but that doesn't mean that they aren't valuable, right? The idea that we shouldn't have an understanding about natures of consent, that we shouldn't have an understanding of what an effective public policy is just because it might not make a 10x ROI, doesn't mean that that isn't something that lawmakers should have a good understanding of when it comes to making their decisions about the types of laws that they then write and implement. But why is it that taking this away from the university is bad? Because universities are good at a few things. The first is they are good at actually making sure that they have standards of quality, making sure that you are doing peer review, making sure that you are actually being open about who your donors are for any sort of research, and making sure that you are using citable evidence for every step along the way are things that the private sector does not inherently care about, right? Think of, for example, all of the research institutes funded by the Koch brothers who deliberately lie about the information that is created by them, who create multiple LLCs to hide where the money is coming from, and don't have to go through any sort of review process in order to publish because they're a privately owned entity. When this money gets funneled into the private sector, the ideological bend remains, but there's no check and balance on this because there's limited accountability, there's no method of pushing back, and there's no way for other researchers to actually check their work because the accountability mechanism of the university now has less money and as a result fewer people to be able to check this. What this means is that you now have worse quality output from any sort of research that happens, meaning that you get less good information for lawmakers. The second thing is that you get a much less choice over what actually gets researched. If you are afraid that your research is going to be slashed by the federal government because you choose to use the word gender, that means that the entirety of gendered medicine doesn't get researched as we are currently seeing in American universities because you don't want to risk your grant funding and wasting 3 years of your career. When then that gets pushed into the actual private market, there's no inherent reason for them to research this. The evidence for this is that the private market currently doesn't research the specific gendered nuances of the effects of specific medications because they don't think it is particularly profitable to design an entire new medication that then can specifically help women in other ways. So this means that you get less output of research as well, which is bad for the system at large. Secondly, I want to talk about students, right? Opening government cares a lot about international students. The problem is that on their side of the house, international students are fucked, panel. Here's why. The first reason is because you now lose to the tune of tens of thousands of university spots per year overnight, because it's not just Harvard that cuts this. Adam notes that it's all of the smaller schools in the United States who now no longer accept them. Opening government says, but they can work at home, and that would be good. No, because most international students, especially ones who come from marginalized backgrounds, are coming here on scholarship because endowments are so big that they can afford to bring them here for free. By contrast, if you live in a low-income country, you either, one, may not afford to be a student for 4 years, or you may have to pay tuition, something that your family cannot afford. This means that fewer people get an education under their side, and they are less able to start a business because they're not able to access the high levels of training that exist. Lastly, on domestic students, I think that this also harms them significantly because government bench would have you believe that the alternative is people are going to become plumbers. They give you no reason for this other than market forces will make you see this as more valuable. I instead suggest something much more pernicious is going to happen. Adam notes that people are still enrolling at university at incredibly high levels despite all the barriers that exist today. When you have less loan money available, what happens is that private banks enter into the situation and thus give loan money regardless, but they do so at higher interest rates with payment plans that are expected to start collecting interest the next day. This means that the very same students who have been sold a lie about the ability to access the middle class now are doing so with more debt and worse payment plans, which means that they are more likely to be trapped in poverty forever. For those reasons, I'm exceptionally proud to oppose.
I am not Ethan, and I have not spent 10 billion years in schooling. Thus, I think I am reasonable in saying there is not that much value to a university education. Our claim is very simple, that this prevents people from going to university and relieves them from the crushing amounts of debt that most American students are currently subject to. A couple of notes, though, before I deliver my extension. It was not enough for opening government to win on the mechanism of less people will go to university. This is given because of the motion. This is not a mechanism. The burdens for Gov are to, one, explain the margins of this claim, specifically how people are deterred and the quantity of people that are deterred. This is very nebulous on their side, and it also means that their claim is margin dependent. The analytical burden has not been met to prove that this affects a large enough group of people, or why we should care about the people that opening government talks about in the first place. The second is to explain why people no longer attending university is actually good. There is a responsive burden here to opening opposition. So their claim is you will do skilled trades to focus on careers, and as OO rightly points out, they don't explain why this would be likely. We are going to do that, thus proving the normative value of the debate. 2 points of extension. The first is analytical. We're going to provide the mechanisms that prove the margin on why people are attritioned out of university. Prestige was an insufficient mechanism for the weaknesses that opening opposition points out. I want to note that they also say they impact very poor people, but this is also not where the margin of the debate lies. Poor people were never going to make the decision to attend huge Ivy Leagues in the first place. This is a decision made by the vast more people who are the lower middle income families or the middle income families who scrape together their savings to send their children to university, this generational wealth investment that is used in far more productive ways on our side. How does this happen? Unique mechanisms that prove margin. First, universities are seen as significantly more volatile. You might get denied your degree. Your funding might get cut because of the current administrations. Teachers are more transient and less stable because of issues with retaining staff and the volatility of funding. This means that people who want to study in particular programs with specific professors no longer have the incentive to attend that university, and also it means that balancing the risks of this volatility and the fact that your money might not manifest into a degree if you do something politically sketchy means that people make the value calculation that university is not worth it. People are generally very risk averse with their dollars. The second is because of less access to student loans. So because the Senate has debated on reducing the endowment to many universities, the pool of money available to domestic students' tuitions is far less. Hence, tuition in the short term becomes significantly more expensive for the next couple of years, meaning people don't select in. Currently, it is cheaper to attend New York universities if you live in New York. Now that the federal government cannot subsidize this, people don't have the incentive to choose to do so. Second part of this is, as they admit, there are going to be fewer international students. International student prices are jacked up to subsidize the domestic students. When the subsidy cannot happen, this means fewer domestic students select into universities. The reason that this is a stronger mechanism is because people don't make decisions based on things as nebulous as prestige. It could always be true that the narrative shifts about how important a Harvard education is. What they do make decisions on is on their dollars. They make decisions on, whether or not there will be predictability in their lives, whether or not they will have the money to fund their education. We have done the analytical work to prove why a large amount of people are now not able to to make these poor financial decisions. Now I'm going to explain why going to university is quite bad. I don't know, what world Ethan is living in where it is really important to have discourse. I'm going to talk about why this is symmetric, but the rate of undergraduate underemployment in the US is extremely high. Most people are in debt for at least 2 years because they have no job after graduating university. The US government has recently reported that fewer young people graduating university than ever are entering the workforce because no one wants to hire them. So the degree that you get doesn't even produce a job because you are the same as every other degree holder because everyone thought that this would give you the leg up. The second mechanism is that these skills are not even particularly useful because the way universities teach is content-based. The reason this has to be instead of the skills that are used in workplaces like innovation, like being creative, is because universities have a lot of students. When you are lecturing to halls of 400 to 500 people, it is difficult to have creative discussions. It is difficult to practice these teamwork skills that become increasingly important in the workplace, given that we are in a knowledge-driven economy. So we have all the knowledge at our fingertips. What we need is these other skills that universities don't teach people for, which means this doesn't even help them retain jobs or doesn't help them get job places that sort through the most deserving candidates. So in many cases, the most deserving people don't get the jobs that they are suited for because we are determining their worth based on their grades, which not everyone can compete on. The impacting here is very simple. Currently, people stay in debt for far longer. They cripple their families. They start off the youngest part of their lives with so much debt, with a piece of paper that is largely useless. And you cannot undermine the importance of debt. The average amount of debt the U.S. student graduates with is between $1,500 to $200,000. The average income of the middle, American family is between $50,000 to $70,000. In no world would it be worth it to give people so much financial anxiety, to prevent them from buying their first cars, from getting a down payment on their home, to get discourse that could happen otherwise. Where is if we can protect anyone from this harm, given that, they do not need to accrue it, we don't even need to prove a counterfactual. We are logically independent from opening government. What is the change on our side? Before that, I'll take a POI.
So your side wants people to attend trade school, but the reason people don't attend trade school is because of
Great, I'm gonna explain. I promise. I'm gonna explain. Shut up. I promise. Okay. Why does this change on our side? One, jobs cannot take signals from degree, so they have to rejig their hiring practices. This costs people far less to get a job. The reasons for this is because, jobs have similar concerns about volatility, which means they don't want to lose out on smart people just because they chose to not take a crazy risk. Second, there's a unique tipping point in speed. Maybe it is true that jobs broadly were going away from degrees, but it's hard to completely go away when many people still decide to compete on their degrees. So now that fewer people are completing their degrees, this pushes the Overton window on how quickly jobs fix their method of evaluations. Third, the credentials of people change to become more skills-based because they write more about being good thinkers and good co-workers. They no longer ask for their transcript, which means transcripts and degreeism are far more optional. There's a positive cyclical effect. People feel they don't need the degree to be competitive, which means they don't need all this job to access the mid-tier entry-level jobs in reception, banking, social media, or consulting firms that we currently require far too much investment for. This is really, really crucial. The second is also because they cannot make this decision anymore because it just becomes too expensive. People select into openings in skilled trades. There are tons of openings. We're going to pay them lots of money because there are currently not enough plumbers. There are currently not enough AC repair people. There's a lot of money to make here. People will not be blindsided. The weighing of this claim against opening is very simple. We prove it on a large number of people and also the specificity of who we're affecting. Very quickly on O, I don't care about a uni education. Research will also still be done in think tanks. This is good to diversify who spreads information.
Okay, I'm going to start on a piece of framing about the kinds of universities that get targeted by this downfall, which I think is disproportionately large research universities and not the small universities that OO tells you about. I'm going to do some responses to OG and introduce our new case, which is that this leads to a decline of progressive bastions in university towns, and this prevents people this leads to a decline of progressivism in the United States. Okay, firstly, on some framing. I think that small state schools, which lack prestige, which disproportionately do teaching and have very little research output, are the least affected by the downfall, which is to say they are the least affected by federal freezes to research because they are the least productive to begin with. They are the most subsidized, and so therefore, and also they're not prestigious to begin with, so they're the least affected. The kinds of universities we are talking about are in fact universities like Harvard, but also large public universities with large research output volumes because they're the most affected by funding cuts to these regions. Okay, on to some refutation to OG. OG says that oh, this will just go to developing countries. If this were true, then they would have thriving research. If they had the incentive and capacity to do so, they would already pay researchers. But the EU doesn't pay researchers because their economy is much shitter and they don't have the resources or networks to do this. Poorer countries don't have the capacity to just absorb all of the students who like lose out these spots. This just means that you lead to a decline overall in the number of institutions. It's not true that they can just, if they remain, there will be like brain gain. They can also just be less productive. Just because you can access things like education doesn't mean you have access to things like venture capital in the region, right? It's not clear that these people can easily transfer their skills, and it's not clear that this research is good. Okay, some more material, on the importance of progressive institutions. I think that universities are incredibly important, not just because of their job function, but also because they have a very important place in conserving American liberalism, which is to say, Americans in the status quo are hugely divided on a political basis by whether or not they are college educated. So college education is a huge predictor of whether or not you will subscribe to things like democracy, liberalism. This makes the OO analysis like, oh, sometimes they teach you a gender, really important, right? This is really important because lots of people who go to university are exposed to new forms of ideas that they would otherwise not be exposed to because they come from small towns, because they come from communities which are not racially diverse, because they don't have experience with the world that allows them to broaden their perspective. Universities are incredibly important, especially in America, as a meeting point for people to be able to interact with classical liberalism, to be able to interact with a diverse range of ideas, and be able to therefore learn from them. This is incredibly important because the alternative to this is an incredibly high degree of siloing and polarization in America, in which many people just are never, especially people who come from small towns, people who come from more rural areas or suburban areas, are never exposed to these kinds of areas. Why is this important? I think that large public universities, especially in swing states, have huge network effects in terms of the progressivism that they can instill. Which is to say, universities like Michigan, like UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina, like Georgia Tech, these universities allow for a huge amount of progressive brain gain in these regions, which is to say, states and counties that might otherwise be conservative are able to attract researchers and attract young college students who oftentimes remain in these states, work in these states, and are able to change the demographic qualities of these regions. Why is it incredibly important why is it then so consequential that these universities are being targeted? Firstly, they are not allowed to they are being targeted on the basis of the liberal ideas that are so important for American progressivism to spread among the youth, which is to say, these cuts target specifically the sorts of left-wing ideologies that are being harmed, but more generally, these sorts of cuts prevent people from entering university. I'll take one from CG.
Yeah, when a white hick farmer from the Rust Belt meets a uni-educated person and they try and discuss democracy, do you think the guy from the Rust Belt ever changes their opinion based on what the university graduate says?
Right. I think that this is quite common in universities. I think you know lots of people from universities who come from small towns, who come from different backgrounds, who are now exposed to new ideas. I think that people go into universities with malleable minds. These are quite formative years of people's lives, and so they are expected to try new things. The university narrative tells you that this is a formative experience. And so the decline of this means that people are no longer prepared to accept universities with open minds. There are large impacts in this. Firstly, there are scalar impacts in terms of the harms that these people perpetuate into their communities, which is to say, when these universities decline in these large college towns and in these regions which are swing states and battlegrounds, right? This means that people who might otherwise be able to find safety in their colleagues, who might otherwise be able to find safety in their friends and support from their community, are less able to find it. They are more able to find ethnic tension and other forms of discrimination. The other thing that is important is that the margins are quite meaningful, which is to say, swing state elections are won on incredibly small margins. The demographic shifts in places like North Carolina, in places like Georgia, are largely driven by the networks that are brought in by these liberalizing universities. This is thus incredibly bad in terms of this, right? The worst case impacts that we can access on CO are the large electoral harms of allowing Trumpism to exist, allowing conservatives to regain influence in terms of the trades. I think trades are really strongly stereotyped as masculine. I think trades actually inculcate incredibly conservative values, which de-emphasize the role of stereotypically effeminate things like office work, and so they therefore also reinforce very harmful gender norms onto the woman in these people's lives because there's also a gender gap in university, right? So this also affects people's interpersonal lives in these towns. Whether these hicks go back and treat women nice or less nice, it's actually quite important, and we should care about them, right? I think this is much more important. Okay, in terms of research, I think that the research that happens is quite important. I don't think that comparative is the private sector. What is important about this research is that American universities uniquely allow the centralization of research that can't happen elsewhere, which is to say they allow the centralization of smart minds, innovative fixed capital technologies to do research that you can't do elsewhere. They allow the centralization of people who have shared values and believe in whatever, the American dream or whatever. When you lose this and they disperse to different places in the world, you are less able to access things like collaboration between leading universities. You are less able to access things like the innovative medical research or agricultural research or any of the life-saving things that we care about. So even if you care about things like developing countries, I think it doesn't really, hegemony is kind of good because it produces better research that leads to things like better medicine and better crops for these regions. I don't care about NUS. Thanks.
The first thing I want to do in this speech is take out OO, and I'm going to do it very cleanly. The first question that I have before extraneous rebuttal is the really clear tension in their case, because I think is quite large, which comes out at the bottom of the DLO, which mitigates the bulk of the speech. Because the way that Ethan tries to very cheekily present an alternative points a really huge question in the state of OO's world. Because what comes out at the end of Ethan's speech? People will still go to university. They'll just take on more interest and more debt that exists, and it'll be more harmful towards them. This is problematic for their claim quite largely, because the bulk of their claim requires you to A, believe that universities themselves are less populated with tuition, which hurts their capacity to do research, and specifically the sort of equitable and good research that they want, and B, tertiarily, that the people that are going there just don't go there as much. So if the secondary alternative is true, it just means that maybe students are put in worse outcomes, which they seem to acknowledge as a trade-off that they'll take, but research gets worse. So this already is a question that OO is unable to answer internally within their speech. Extraneously, though, I'm going to offer 3 points of rebuttal to the extent of the research claim that come out to OO. Let's deal with the first one, that if universities fall, research vanishes into profit-driven, private-only lab. Here's the reality check, guys. In the status quo, the private sector already performs 80% of all R&D. The ship has sailed far long ago. The downfall just forces everybody to admit it. Don't worry, I'll talk about the equity stuff later. The question, though, is about oversight, because I think this is a reasonable claim that comes out in OO. Here's the problem. This is also just empirically not true. It doesn't disappear with IV bricks. FDA drug trials, EPA emissions, SEC disclosure lines, EPA AI-style regulations in the EU. Peer-reviewed journals still exist in the private sector. There are lots of litigation that happen wherever the lab is housed. The accountability apparatus is statutory and market-based, not campus-based. So it seems to imply that the secondary harm that exists on OO about research, that's to say that your research is done without checks and balances, is just untrue. But there's an added upside here, and this is the flip, which is to say that spun-off public institutes like the NIH Clinical Center or the new, I forgot the node that exists in Boston, can contract open data release clauses that are harder to enforce to tenure-protected campus labs. So this is to say even research that happens on university, due to mechanisms like tenure, have an incentive for professors to care about their own prestige and subsequently not decimated. So good research, and by good research, by the way, I mean the groundbreaking stuff that saves lives, so real hard work on cancer molecules that professors want to delay because they want to post it at specific publications to gain the most amount of prestige, doesn't happen as much, and the incentive to do so isn't there. So profit perhaps is a better incentive for the most life-saving sorts of surgeries, and life-saving sorts of research to exist anyways. But two, let's talk about the equity stuff, because I also think this is untrue. Because here's the problem. Unprofitable, equity-driven research dies because companies won't fund it, is I think the premise of this claim. Here's the issue. The world doesn't exist in the US, and I don't know why all of opening thinks the world is the US. The first thing to say here is obviously there's Europe, and it's a quite big part of the debate. I think it's like 8 billion euros in 2025 alone is ring-fenced for shit like climate justice, for rare disease science, for biodiversity. And there's also stuff like the Gates Foundation. There's lots of billion-dollar funds that are willing to spend money on equity research that are not necessarily premised in the United States of America. And what that means is that international universities and mission institutes fill the non-profit niche of equity that I think is sufficient, because they don't explain uniquely why America is the only institution or only capacity of universities that have the ability to do this equity-driven research. So you should, at the very least, question why, if America itself as an institution, and credit their entire claim, stops doing, research into gender-based forgot the example they gave. The gender-based solutions for people, it implies a massive decrease in the accessibility or production of this research in the world. So the margin on this seems to be either A, low, I think it exists to some extent, but B, and I think more importantly, doesn't get that harmed anyways under their side of the house because it's non-exclusive. Things like ISMER labs or the South American lab for like influenza seems to still exist, and this continues and accelerates as talents and grants reroute away from overpriced US campuses anyways, which seems to be the flip if people in America don't go to these schools. Comparative though, even inside America, we think equity research is already generally grant funded, and fights for lab space are often against lucrative biotech spin-offs. So removing the tuition cross-subsidy means that you free federal dollars to go directly to standalone centers whose sole mandate is public interest work anyways. So the capacity there probably gets higher. The third thing here is that they say that there's an equity-driven research vacuum that happens. The problem is I think that breakthroughs tend to diffuse digitally. So this is to say if a US campus shutters a lab, the field marches on anyways because people will just go to the other labs that still do this sort of research. It's likely to exist nonetheless. The net takeaway here is that OO had a larger burden than they seem to imply to themselves. They have to prove a collapse of socially valuable research entirely as a result of American universities driven. The problem is smart people still exist. They'll likely still go elsewhere. Other universities being large and successful probably is symmetric in this debate, which also calls a lot of doubt into OG. Maybe call it a knife, but I'll explain that in a second because I just don't think it is. It's just reasonably true that these universities exist because the rankings are structural. They're not, what's the word? Rankings are structural, not opportunistic. So this is to say that demographics like the huge STEM cohorts in India and China, sovereign wealth endowments for other schools, and English language programs that are targeted at global accolades make sure that schools like Tsinghua, like Oxford, like UFT, or Melbourne keep climbing. So it doesn't seem intrinsic that the downfall of American universities are the core reason why other international schools get better anyways. I think all of this implies three things. One, that the margin of research on OO is likely massively dubious. So the large bulk of the impacting that comes out of the DLO shouldn't change the margin of the debate all that massively. Two, and I think probably more crucially important, given that they seem to claim the tuition is likely to happen anyways, it seems that students get into these circumstances nonetheless. Finally then, let me talk about our claim, and I think this is, the reason I don't engage with CO very much is really simply, I just think it's okay if people aren't liberal. They don't really explain necessarily why you become more progressive, you go vote progressive. That's the only response I'm gonna give. I hope the whip does more. Sorry. Lastly, let me explain on our claim and just be very simple about where we extend underneath OG and how large this is in context for the debate. Our claim, I think, is just this. Debt is really fucking bad. The downfall of university, like everyone in this debate seems to agree, implies that people just don't go to university in the United States of America as much. I think this is a reasonable conclusion to draw from the motion. Here's the mechanisms that Emily gives that are unique. The first thing that we fill in is not just people don't go to university so they don't take out school, but two, the debt in of itself is already maxed out and painfully expensive in the United States of America. So families who believe in the degree premium still look at the amortization table and they walk away because it's massively expensive. She tells you that repayment started and shreds credit. She tells you that broader household budgets are already under siege massively, given that the mortgage rates have doubled in 2022, and all this means that the degrees themselves have become more expensive. What this means is that the student loan debt system that's uniquely toxic to individuals looks like trapping adults into a young adults into a negative net worth trap where they can't ever escape it because it compounds interest at 6 to 8%, which already happens. It means that these are things that people reasonably in the United States suffer from. 48% of Americans suffer from the $2 trillion debt budget that exists. This is the only way to free them from that. So it's a good positive impact that isn't very high burden. CG.
First two things, I'll go round team by team, starting from OG. First, number one, I think on the opening half, or on OG, I think they don't contend, I think, with Aubrey and OO's very important framing that the downfall will not manifest out of nowhere. And on the framing, I think you should weigh opposition bench inherently over government bench because we can charitably with the status quo, taking into account how Trump's very egregious action on universities is probably the most likely cause of the downfall, right? This probably has to be addressed, I think, on likelihood. I think number two, on why people are able to buy into universities with institutional legitimacy prior to the downfall, such as because I think inherently people I think have individual ambition, right? I think that's inherently the prestigious Harvard and Yale. I think it uniquely incentivizes people to go to university. On Common App, there's Reach University, there's Target Universities, and such and such and such, like safeties, right? There's different priorities. I think there's different motivations for students to uniquely pursue these higher prestige. I think prestige is a very, very good motivator for people to continue college education. Okay, first on OG, they make a couple of pushes. Number one is the more diverse international and cultural norms. I think brain drain and symmetrical. I go to Oxford, I work at the Bank of England. I think the urbanized and modernized economies will always have more better unpopular institutions, even if it's not Western developing country. Developed countries will probably have a large popularity, anyway, in terms of academia. Like we see this in Manila, Kuala Lumpur, Tsinghua, Peking, for example. U.S. hegemony, I think, over information. I think it's what claim they make on OG. I think but they don't give a counterfactual, right? I think the likely counterfactual is that countries that are highly economically prosperous probably have hegemony over academia anyway. How is prestige generated when rich people are able to fund education? Therefore, this is how it ties to rich economies, right? At the end of the case, I think we weigh over them because they do not provide a reason why academia is culturally more decentralized and spread out around the world. What incentivizes it to happen? And two, their principles weaken because of their uncomparative premise. I'll take you at 5. And I think they would give you pretty well mechanized points on why there's why there's progressivism. I think on university, right? It's very exclusive. I think on CEO because without entering universities, you aren't exposed to new ideas. People are less incentivized to travel between states and go to more urban modern places. University discourse is a very unique environment to cultivate youth activists. I think to address issues. When you're talking with a progressive friend, you learn these ideas and you internalize them subconsciously or consciously. Then you go to your communities. You address systemic racism and sexism in the workplace, right? Socialization with urban progressive views allows for this uniquely on our side. This can't happen when Trump is persecuting everyone. I think the tipping point here is Trump's persecution and the process of downfall inspires fear in these students, disincentivizing them from enrolling in universities as a whole and delegitimizing these large institutions. When enrollment is less, there's less socialization, there's less progressive views being exchanged. I think Aubrey gives a very clear impact on how states win by very, very narrow margins. Georgia won by 10,000 votes, and a university has 30 an average university has 30,000 enrollments, right? I think there's a pretty a clear margin of likelihood that we're probably able to foster more progressive individuals. Conservatism in America is very, very dangerous because of the deportation crises, for example. There's a bunch of very important issues like abortion rights, trans rights. That's very contentious in America. I think progressivism is probably very good on that. No. I think number 2 on OG, the astronomical tuition. Why do people have an incentive to go to university in status quo? Because they're probably incentive for white-collar jobs and such, the career goals, whatever. But I think that ZPM concedes they make a more rational decision when going to universities. They opt out when they are financially unable to. I think on OG's best case, where more people pursue alternative, I think CG does a better job in explaining why universities are inherently good. We outweigh because we talk about progressivism. We also talk about how you get more cohesive research outputs. I think on the funding violence part, of course, the military-industrial complex exists. I think that's pretty asymmetrical. I think, on O, then, I think we agree with the O framing, as Aubrey first pointed out, in the POI to OG. But we specifically tell you that smaller states universities are less on the margin on this debate, right? I think we tell you, I think they make a couple pushes. Number 1 is open speech, whatever. I think a bunch of facts about what Trump is doing. I think that O successfully points out contemporary challenges with Trump. I think that Aubrey extends upon this and tells you why specifically this inhibits social movements and youth advocacy and internal discourse within these youth, right? O's best terminal impact is probably nebulous, just bad quality of life. I think Aubrey mechanizes why the margins are very, very important, particularly in the case of progressivism. I think that college graduates are the tipping point often in a lot of state and municipal elections. Inherently, when progressivism is able to be entrenched into power, there's probably less deportation, more social rights for people. When people are able to advocate for these individuals and not prevent policy that's really discriminatory in American conservatism. Right? I think on weighing, I think we give you higher magnitude. I think on research, then I think I think the likely counterfactual is the private sector. On O, but I think that we tell you that the private sector is probably symmetrical. We contended this and tell you that the counterfactual is decentralized research. Europe is in debt. The counterfactual is probably more universities across the world getting less funding. The biggest delta is not the research will decrease because the private sector is irresponsible and bad, but by the large university promoting buy-in to research with large academic influence will decline. Therefore, that's less research output, but also very, very integrally produces less researchers. Right? All the 5-year politicians are all fucking Columbia educated and Harvard educated. That's people going into research are just these educated with these very prestigious institutions that only have buy-in because of their institutional legitimacy prior to the downfall. On the government counterfactual, we have less precision institutional legitimacy to big institutions, which get a very large share of academia, right? Sure, take OG.
U.S. students are more likely to tend towards right-wing populism when they feel that the current progressive-led economic system is not working for them. This is more likely on your side when you're pushed into a university degree, can't find a job, and can't pay your debt back. This flips your progressive.
Can you find a Trump supporter in this room? What we are saying is that universities that are inherently predisposed to be more progressive, you're getting more progressive, almost echo chambers in which people are exposed to these ideas, and therefore buying to progressivism much more easily. Those are the margins in which we're talking about. Okay, quickly on CG. I think their most biggest push is more debt get is really, really bad, right? I think on the counterfactual, I think they're unable to confirm the margin in which individuals are opting out of very high tuition. Presumably, if you can't afford it, you just like work for a couple of years or such, right? But I think they highlight key issue, like high student debt. We agree. I think this is uncomparative because I think university, number one, is a very fundamental mechanism for developing very important like things like STEM. You learn pharmacology, mathematics, knowledge base that's very, very technical and very hands-on, very experience-based, right? You also get a lot of professional development, like co-op, hands-on, lab work, research. What makes university exclusive is it teaches you how to think. You unconsciously learn how to make arguments by like watching your professors. You interact with smart people and internalize very important information. You mature as an individual by interacting socially. I think the way here is certainty. I think we tell you like it's very clear when students are scared of going to university because of the downfall narrative of persecution. I think people are going less into communities and advocating. They're like less like able to like be like socialized and develop themselves. I think the consequences of American conservatism again very damaging. I think the magnitude here is very, very like clear, and the likelihood is also very clear. I think the margin of this debate ultimately is I think progressivism and its impact ultimately in American communities. I think we're best able to prove that research, I think, on the tipping point is specifically the institutional appeal of these large American institutions, the prestige and the buy-in, and I think it ultimately generates better researchers.
Thank you very much for the very fine speech. Thank you for the fine debate. Let's vote. I can shortly this.
All right. Bada bing, bada boom. All right. Won't keep you in suspense for long. The call is as follows. We give the 1 to OO, we give the 2 to CG, we give the 3 to OG, we give the 4, unfortunately, to CO. The chair split for CO and the 2. So I will do the splits not involving CO. Great, let's go through top path. OG, OO. What are the main things that we get from OG? For OG, we get a few things. First is this analysis on brain drain. Next is the arguments regarding US students and saving them from debt. And then there's analysis on US hegemony ideologically, globally. From OO, what are the main things that we get? First is benefits and harms for students, especially focusing on American students. And then there's all of that, the analysis on research. Okay, let me first explain why large chunks of the OG are not particularly creditable because of missing links. So one example is brain drain. As many other teams point out, it is a little bit unclear to us why, if I'm a talented, bright young high school student in Bangladesh, and if Harvard goes to shit, why I will go to a university in my or near my country rather than to, say, a European university that's really good like Oxford or something like that. And so it is a little bit unclear to us how much you're actually fighting brain drain. And I think that in the absence of analysis to explain that to us, we struggle to then credit the impacts of these people staying at home, helping the economy, doing research that is tailored to those countries rather than just fucking off to somewhere other than the United States. Oh, I probably shouldn't swear if it's being recorded. Oh my, I'm sorry. Okay, great. Let's talk about then the stuff on US thought, hegemony, etc. I think that there were differences of opinion on the panel with regards to the extent to which we can credit this. I thought that the terminal impacting just wasn't really there in terms of what happens when America, in some vague sense, controls what the world thinks. I don't exactly know how they use that power, and I don't exactly know how a more heterogeneous, diversified research global system would necessarily be better. I do think some of the specific examples chosen were quite weak with regards to like the idea that American government pressures universities to do research into military technology. This is of course true, but it doesn't seem very relevant to like how America distorts the ideology of the world, or at least it's not explicitly relevant. And then similarly stuff on why it is that America just doesn't study some diseases because of racism. Like I assume that in a sort of more multipolar world where China has a big say and Europe has more of a say over like the ideas of the globe, they could also just be racist. And so I don't know like exactly how are they going to be differentially racist, things like that. So I think it's struggled to see exactly what's going to happen here and how much better things are going to be in your world. Okay, let's now talk about students. This is like obviously the main thing that we credit OG with. Unsurprisingly, it's what we think they spend most of their time on. Let's talk about why we think students, the benefits for students fall under OO. So the first thing to note is I do think there's one question that isn't really asked very much from other teams, which is in a world where American universities go south, why don't American students just go abroad for university? I think that is a question mark I have, but I don't credit that. I don't consider that too much in the call because I don't think there's much pushback on that point. So let's set that point aside for now. The main claims here are quite simple. It's just when we get rid of this prestige that is sort of swamping large American universities, then we get way less people going, and this is good because sort of everyone who has an undergraduate degree is unemployed these days, and it is far better for their livelihoods if they go towards cheaper career-based educational programs and whatnot and get employable certificates. I think that a large assumption made by the OG and also made by CG, which I think undermines both the degree to which both gov teams can get very far in the round, is that in your world, employers will, to a significant extent, require less degrees when they are hiring people. I think that I'll elaborate a little bit more on this with respect to CG, because I think CG tries to prove it, whereas from OG it's a little more asserted and just connected to prestige. I don't know why it is that like when employers are hiring and firing, they necessarily go based on prestige. To what extent do they go based on prestige, for example? I don't really know. And so I think that this is not proven particularly well from OG, but I'll discuss like sort of the more structural problems when I talk about it with regards to CG. Okay, let's now finally bring in what OO says on research, what OO says on students, and why I think they're able to, at the very least, battle to a draw on students and then win on research. With regards to OO and students, I think that they convince us that at the very least in the interim, there's a harm for American students, because it is just fact claim that we still see, as they say, pretty record high rates of enrollment into universities by American students, and they are facing the brunt of significantly higher tuition costs because of the problems that they analyze with regards to the funding cuts, less international students who are then less able to subsidize the domestic students, less scholarships for domestic students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at the very least in the interim, they're doing quite well, and I think that they push OG quite well on the extent to which prestige actually is the be-all and end-all in terms of whether people are going to university. And so they convince us that for the American students that keep going to university in a world where the downfall exists, things are much, much, much worse for them, even not only for reasons of finances, but also for reasons of free speech and things of that sort. And then at OG's best, for the American students who then no longer go, I think that it is then, okay, maybe better for them, but I don't actually know at the end of top half exactly how big these two groups are. And so it's hard for me to conclusively justify an OG ballot on that basis. And then I think the far more simple justification is, like, let's say that's a wash, or let's say that goes slightly to OG. I just think OO is winning on research. I think they're able to explain to us why there's just so much funding that is being lost precisely because of just how antithetical the right-wing machine is to universities, and how that's been a decades-long process to get them riled up as much as humanly possible. And so why they're doing such dramatic cuts, and why they will continue to do such dramatic cuts, which precludes really, really valuable research that benefits people all over the globe from happening in the first place, research that just wouldn't be profitable. I think that a good example is given where policymaking with regards to, like, a private company doesn't have a strong incentive to do R&D on government tax rates necessarily, or perhaps more abstractly on, like, I don't know, whether our government should do art installations or whatever. And then also stuff on, like, more woke research that private companies it wouldn't be profitable for them to do because they deal with a subsect of the population. I think that all this is well done. I think that the pushback from OG is a little weak. The main pushback to this is, well, other countries will just fill in the gaps. The funders are going to flock to the other countries once the US institutions lose their prestige. The difficulty here is, okay, maybe this is true for however many private companies contract American institutions to do research. Those private people can just go elsewhere, send their money elsewhere. But it's obviously not the case that the American government, when they're cutting funding for universities, is then going to send funding to, like, European universities, for example. And so I don't understand how this sort of funding redirection argument ensures that there isn't this massive gulf in terms of research that is valuable, that improves people's lives. I will say just quickly, there's some weirdness on OO in terms of the claim that money is going to be, like, funneled into Koch brothers NGOs or whatever. I'm a judge who has a judge philosophy that if something doesn't make sense and isn't proven at all, I kind of just ignore it. And I think ignoring it helps OO in this case because it makes it seem like there's just a bigger margin of change in terms of whether the research happens rather than necessarily in terms of who does the research. But even if we assume that necessarily is the kind of factual, because they did assert it, I think they do a good enough job of showing why it is that research is far better when it's done in the sort of accountable, transparent ways that you describe rather than in the ways that would be done by NGOs, which oftentimes have sort of capture by bad actors. Okay, great. So that's big picture why research students at best ends up being kind of a wash or slightly leaning towards OG. Bringing CG into the round. Okay, so I think CG does a few things. One of the things I will say, and again, it's rare that this matters, but I do think that given how close it was between CG and OO, engagement mattered. And when OO was trying to give a POI on
like the alternative that you are defending, and it gets cut off before we can hear anything in the POI, I think that does allow me to think that that's something I'm going to consider with respect to the split. It's not like, obviously it's not the decisive factor, but I do think that OO was not given the chance to respond as much as would have been nice. Let's now talk about the main CO push. So CO got basic, sorry, excuse me, CG, my bad, sorry, yeah, I'm hot, we're all hot here. Okay. Main CGG push is proving the margin of change in terms of why it is that there's going to be way less students coming here, thus buttressing the extent of the OG claims on avoiding debt. Okay, I think that the reasons given were good, not great. I think that they were like fine. They were certainly better than the OGs. Again, as you accuse, more nebulous argument of just prestige. It's unclear to what extent students do in fact decide based on prestige, or in fact when they're making like massive monumental life decisions, rather instead on the things that you identify, which is more rational factors. So analysis given on terms of university volatility, access to less loans, less international students, etc. Okay, and then I think that this is certainly better than your OG in terms of proving a large margin of change for these people getting out and not getting trapped into this system. Then we have to analyze why that's a good thing. So what does CG say? I think that CG definitely does a better job than the top half proving exactly why it is that university degrees are as useless as their top half says, in terms of being too content-based, not enough skills-based, given the large class sizes, few professors, etc. And the analysis of just like sort of the better labor market analysis, supply and demand in terms of degrees, and like analysis, further analysis on debt with regards to things like compounding interest and whatnot. But that's not much better than what their top half gives. But let's now talk about what is noticeably better, which is how you analyze the job market in terms of whether you need a university degree to get like an entry-level job. The claims here is that when we have significantly fewer people with degrees, we're going to be shifting to Overton window, and so now you just don't need a degree for this entry-level position, and this is good for all the reasons that CG describes. So I think this is certainly better than top half, because I think top half just kind of asserts that employers are going to require it less, or hinges this on the prestige point. But I don't think this is enough to beat OO. And the reason why is this. I just don't understand why it is that if I'm a company that, as you concede, has way, way, way more applicants than I have slots, why once less of those applicants have university degrees, I'm going to suddenly start looking at all of the ones who don't have university degrees, rather than just picking from the smaller subset of applicants that do in fact have university degrees. It seems to me like university degrees are still going to be a plus, or at the very least you don't really convince me why they won't be, or why they won't be seen as them, especially if they're seen as such in the status quo. And so I think that it is unclear to me the margin of change in terms of whether people actually will be able to get those entry-level jobs without degrees, or whether instead it'll just be the richest people who can afford to go to university despite the less access to loans, despite the volatility, etc. And so I'm just a little bit unclear on exactly how good it's going to be for people when they don't go to university, which obviously I think the CEG case relies on to a very large extent. But even if I don't think that, I do think that OO's research analysis just seems to me to have a significantly larger scope and severity with regards to sort of a lot of life-changing, life-saving research and a lot of sort of societally transformational research. I think that, as I said before, OO's analysis on students is good, and so even if I, like I did on top half, that there's maybe a wash or a slight CG advantage in terms of benefits to American students, I think the tiebreaker quite clearly can be this research stuff. With that in mind, let's now talk quickly about why I don't think CG is able to take down OO's research stuff. I think that the responses to this just tend to, obviously it's more nuanced than this, but the responses almost across the board just tend to be, well, there are some other people who, in both sides, will do the valuable research that OG wants to be done by American universities. This is, of course, true, and it's well proven, but I think that the OG claim at its core is just, it's good if we have more of this research because this research makes the world a better place. They convince us that prior to the downfall, American universities had billions and billions of dollars flowing around for this research, and so it's probably better if we have both Bill Gates and American universities providing this valuable world-improving research rather than merely having Bill Gates or merely having Europe. The closest they get to overcoming this is a claim about rerouting smart people. I just think this is undercooked, and it's not explained exactly why it is that this ensures that European research output will go up to such an extent. Can they afford to hire way more of these fleeing American professors or whatever? I don't know. Do they have capacity? I don't know. And if it's about swapping shitty European researchers for better American professors, to what extent does that actually increase like the benefits of research that OO describes? I just don't know. I also just don't think there's the tension in the OO case that you outlined. I don't think, like you say, Ethan says that, well, you'll still go to university, but he also says that there's less research because there's less tuition. I just don't think this is how OO frames the research point. I think their claim is you get way less grants. I think the average intelligent voter has read all of the newspaper headlines about how it is that research is under attack in America. It's primarily a matter of freezing this money for grants and canceling contracts, etc., things of that nature. And so I think OO can have their cake and eat it too. And they say, yeah, you hike the tuition rates to stay alive as a university under attack from a hostile American government, and you have all your grants cut and whatever, so you have to go into austerity mode and not do valuable research. I think they can have their cake and eat it too because they prove to us exactly how much attack is being done onto American universities. And so I think that their research stuff is fine at the end of the short diagonal. And so I think that they win on the tiebreaker of research, even if you think CG is slightly ahead on students. Okay, sorry for going a bit long on that, CO.
Just really quickly on CO, I think ultimately the split kind of ended up being like due to a difference of just what we chose to credit from CO. I think those of us who split for CO in the floor we were just kind of unclear as to what CO was able to prove to us, because I think the main pushes that CO give us are basically contingent on the fact that people who go to university and who come to these areas will, meet new people, have new experiences, and basically become more progressive, become more woke, and more open-minded. I think the problem to this case is that we're unsure of how much better it gets past that point. Even if we take at face value that yes, it is true that the vast majority of people who come to university will become more progressive, we're unsure as to why this matters in the end, because at best, even if people congregate in like one swing state city or a bunch of them across the state, one seat or a few more seats in Congress, we're unsure as to how much more gender affirming care legislation gets passed. We're unsure how much more reproductive rights that actually pass. And I think that to that extent then, I think because of the fact that we have to do a lot of the work for CO to make sure that they have any kind of impact on reaching the end goal of being able to protect these vulnerable people, I think at the end of the day, we just don't really credit that much, proven constructive from them, and which is then why we believe that they kind of just fall to the other teams in the round who have better proven constructive.
Cool. All right. I think we're good. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Ask for personal.